China has built a cargo ship that never stops for fuel. Not for a month, not for a year, for the entire working life of the vessel, one single load of fuel, and then the ship dies of old age before the fuel runs out. The thing powering it isn't a normal reactor either. It's a design that America built, switched on, ran successfully, proved worked, and then locked in a filing cabinet for 50 years and walked away from. And China just quietly took it out of the cabinet, scaled it up, and bolted it into the hull of the largest container ship ever designed. If that sounds like a headline exaggeration, stay with me, because the strange part isn't the reactor. The strange part is why nobody else did this first, and the answer has almost nothing to do with the technology. This video is going to break the whole thing down in plain language. No jargon, no equations, no confusing diagrams. Just the real story of what China actually built, why the shipping industry is quietly panicking about it, and the one problem standing in the way that has nothing to do with physics at all. Let's get into it. For about 70 years, global shipping ran on one very simple idea. Make the ship bigger, and everything gets better. A bigger ship carries more boxes. More boxes on one hull means the cost of moving each individual box goes down. Lower cost per box means cheaper goods. Cheaper goods means more trade. More trade means you build an even bigger ship. That loop is the reason you can buy a television made on the other side of the planet for less than the cost of a nice dinner. It's one of the most successful economic streaks in human history, and almost nobody thinks about it because the entire thing happens quietly, out at sea, where nobody's watching. We went from ships carrying a few hundred containers in the 1960s to a few thousand by the 1990s to over 24,000 containers on a single hull today. A modern container ship is longer than the Empire State Building is tall. If you stacked the containers from one ship end to end, you'd have a line of steel boxes stretching about 150 kilometers. But here's the part that doesn't make it onto the shipping industry's marketing slides. That streak is over. The ships have stopped getting meaningfully bigger, and they stopped for a boring reason. They physically don't fit anymore. The Suez Canal has a width, the Strait of Malacca has a depth, ports have crane arms that only reach so far across a hull. Somewhere around 24,000 containers, you run out of planet. So the industry hit a wall. And when you can't make the ship bigger, there is only one lever left to pull. You have to change what's burning inside it. Here's something that genuinely surprised me the first time I understood it properly. And the fuel it burns isn't the clean stuff. A large container ship burns roughly 250 tons of fuel oil per day at full speed per day. That's about 11 tons an hour, every hour, for weeks at a time, on a single vessel. And the fuel it burns isn't the clean stuff. Heavy fuel oil is the residue left over at the bottom of the barrel after refineries have taken everything valuable out of the crude. It's so thick that at room temperature it barely flows. It has to be heated before it can even be pumped into the engine. It is, functionally, the sludge nobody else wanted, and the shipping industry buys it because it's cheap. Now scale that up. There are roughly 60,000 large commercial vessels on the water at any given moment. Global shipping burns somewhere in the range of 300 million tons of fuel every single year, and it produces close to 3% of all human carbon emissions. If global shipping were a country, it would be one of the 10 largest polluters on Earth. And fuel isn't a side cost. On a long-haul voyage, fuel can be somewhere between 40 and 60% of the total operating cost of the ship. Every extra knot of speed costs money in a way that goes up brutally fast. Push the speed up by 10%, and the fuel burn can jump by a third because water resistance doesn't scale politely. So the shipping industry has been trapped in the same equation for decades. Go slow and save fuel, but lose money on delivery times. Go fast and hit your schedules, but set fire to your margins. Every alternative that's been proposed runs into the same wall. Liquefied natural gas burns cleaner, but it still burns, it still emits, and it takes up enormous tank space that could have been carrying cargo. Green ammonia is toxic, and you'd need to build an entire global production industry that doesn't currently exist. Methanol has less than half the energy density of oil, so you need double the tanks. Batteries aren't even in the conversation. To cross the Pacific on batteries, you'd need a battery pack heavier than the ship. Every single option trades cargo space for fuel space. Every single one makes the ship carry less and earn less. Every one except one. Here's where the story gets strange, because nuclear cargo ships aren't a new idea at all. They're an old idea that already failed. 3 times. In 1962, the United States launched a ship called the Savannah. It was beautiful. Genuinely, it looked like a yacht that had been stretched into a freighter, all white curves and swept lines, because it was designed as much to be a symbol as a ship. It was nuclear-powered. It could sail around the world 14 times without refueling. It worked perfectly, technically speaking. It was retired after 8 years. Germany built one, the Otto Hahn. It ran for about a decade, sailed hundreds of thousands of nautical miles, and was then converted back to diesel. Japan built one, the Mutsu. It leaked a small amount of radiation during its very first sea trial. Nothing dangerous, but the timing was catastrophic. Fishing communities blockaded the port and refused to let it come home. The ship spent weeks stranded at sea, unable to dock in its own country. It never carried a single commercial cargo. Only Russia made it work, with a vessel called the Sevmorput, which is still technically in service today and is the only nuclear-powered merchant ship on Earth. But it was built for Arctic routes, where the alternative was no shipping at all, so the economics were never really tested. Now, the obvious conclusion here is that nuclear shipping failed because the technology was bad. It wasn't. Every one of those ships did exactly what it was designed to do. They failed for 3 completely different reasons, and understanding those 3 reasons is the entire key to this story, because they're the exact 3 things China has spent the last decade attacking. Reason 1, the reactors were pressurized water reactors, same design as a submarine, same design as a power station. That means water held at enormous pressure, sitting inside a steel vessel. If that vessel is ever breached, the water flashes to steam instantly, and you have a very serious problem in a very small space. On a ship, that means an enormous amount of shielding, containment, and reinforcement, weight that eats directly into the cargo you're being paid to carry. Reason 2, they were tiny. The Savannah carried about 60 containers worth of cargo. The economics never had a chance because the reactor cost was spread over almost nothing. Reason 3, and this is the one that actually killed them. The port said no. We'll come back to that one. It's the reason this entire story might still collapse, and it has absolutely nothing to do with engineering. Between 1965 and 1969, at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, a team of American engineers ran an experiment for over 20,000 hours. They built a reactor that didn't use solid fuel rods. Instead, the fuel was dissolved into a molten salt, a liquid heated until it flowed like water, circulating through the core. The fuel wasn't sitting inside the coolant. The fuel was the coolant. And that one change does something genuinely elegant. In a conventional reactor, if the core overheats, you have a crisis because solid fuel keeps generating heat and the water around it can boil away. In a molten salt reactor, if the core overheats, the liquid expands, and as it expands, the fuel spreads further apart, and the reaction naturally slows down. The physics fights back against the accident instead of amplifying it. Then there's the part that sounds almost too simple to be real. At the bottom of the reactor, there's a drain pipe, and in that pipe is a plug of the same salt, kept frozen solid by a small cooling fan. It's called a freeze plug. If the power fails, a blackout, a flood, a total loss of control, anything, the fan stops, the plug melts, and gravity does the rest. The entire fuel load drains out of the core into shallow tanks below, where it spreads out, cools, and solidifies. The reaction stops on its own, with no operator, no pump, no electricity, no decision made by anyone. It's a reactor whose safety system runs on a power cut. And because the salt operates at normal atmospheric pressure instead of high pressure, there's no steam explosion risk at all. You don't need the massive pressure containment structure, which means you don't need the massive weight, which means on a ship, you get your cargo space back. Oak Ridge proved it worked. It ran, it functioned, and then it was canceled. The reasons were political and strategic rather than technical. The alternative reactor line produced material useful for weapons programs, and it was already established, already funded, already staffed. The molten salt design didn't fit the strategic picture of the era, so the program was shut down, the reports were archived, and the engineers moved on. Those reports were declassified. They were public. Anyone could read them. For about 50 years, almost nobody did. In 2011, China formally started a molten salt reactor program, and they did something very deliberate about it. They went and got the Oak Ridge documents, all of them. Decades of American research, freely available, essentially untouched, and they treated it as a starting line rather than a history lesson. Then they went out into the Gobi Desert to a site in Gansu province and started building. In 2021, they completed a small experimental molten salt reactor. In 2023, they were licensed to operate it. And within the following couple of years, they achieved something that had never been done outside of that one American experiment half a century earlier: sustained operation of a working thorium molten salt reactor, including refueling the reactor while it was still running. That last part matters more than it sounds. Conventional reactors have to be shut down to be refueled. A reactor that can be topped up while it's operating is a reactor that never has to stop. Now put that on a ship, and that's exactly what happened next. At a shipbuilding exhibition in Shanghai, when Jiangnan Shipyard, one of the largest shipbuilders on the planet, unveiled a design called the CUM-24AP. The numbers are, frankly, ridiculous. 24,000 containers, roughly 400 meters long, over 60 meters wide. It would be the largest container ship ever built. And instead of a bunker of heavy fuel oil and a colossal diesel engine occupying the bottom of the hull, it carries a thorium molten salt reactor driving electric propulsion. Zero emissions at sea. No sulfur, no soot, no carbon dioxide, no exhaust plume. Effectively, no refueling for the operational lifetime of the vessel. And here's the number that actually changes the industry, the one that isn't about the environment at all. It isn't the emissions figure. It isn't the size. It's the speed. Every large container ship on the water today practices something called slow steaming. They deliberately sail well below their maximum speed, typically somewhere around 16 to 18 knots instead of the 24 or 25 they're capable of, for one single reason: fuel. Because fuel burn rises roughly with the cube of speed, going faster is punishingly expensive. Add a few knots and your fuel bill doesn't creep up, it explodes. So the entire global supply chain has quietly agreed to move slower than it can, because moving fast costs more than the cargo is worth. Now remove fuel cost from the equation. A reactor doesn't burn more thorium because you ask the ship to go faster. The fuel load is fixed. The energy is already aboard. The marginal cost of an extra knot of speed drops to almost nothing, which means a nuclear container ship can run flat out, permanently, on every voyage, forever, and it costs the operator essentially the same as running slow. Think about what that does. A Shanghai to Rotterdam voyage that currently takes around 30 days could be done in something closer to 20. Cut a third off the transit time of the world's busiest trade lane, and you don't just save time. You change how much inventory every company on Earth needs to hold. You change warehouse economics. You change how much capital is sitting frozen inside steel boxes floating on water at any given moment. Right now, at any moment, there are trillions of dollars of goods sitting on ships doing nothing except moving slowly. Speed up the fleet and you release an enormous amount of trapped value. And there's a second-order effect that's even stranger. If one operator has ships that are meaningfully faster and structurally cheaper to run, every competitor has a problem that can't be solved by working harder. They can't slow steam their way out of it. They can't negotiate a better fuel price because their rival isn't buying fuel. That's not a competitive advantage. That's a different category of vessel. So the obvious question is, if the physics works and the economics work, why isn't every shipping company on Earth ordering these tomorrow? And this is where the story stops being about engineering entirely. Here is the problem that has stopped nuclear shipping dead for 60 years, and it is almost comically mundane. The ports won't let it in. A commercial cargo ship is not a warship. It doesn't get to dock wherever it wants. It arrives at a commercial port, in a country with its own laws, its own regulator, its own inspectors, and its own extremely nervous local population. And a huge number of the world's major ports have standing rules, or simply standing practice, that make bringing a reactor into a crowded harbor effectively impossible. This is exactly what killed the Savannah. It wasn't the reactor. It was that the ship kept arriving at ports that either refused entry outright or demanded so much paperwork, inspection, escort, and special handling that the visit cost more than the cargo earned. A cargo ship that can't reliably dock isn't a cargo ship. It's an expensive sculpture. Then there's insurance, which is arguably worse. Commercial shipping runs on liability. Every vessel is insured, every cargo is insured, and the whole system works because insurers can calculate the worst-case cost of an incident. With a nuclear vessel, the worst case isn't a cargo loss, it's a contamination event in a densely populated harbor. There are international conventions covering nuclear liability at sea, but they were largely written decades ago. Several were never widely ratified, and the practical result is that no underwriter can confidently price the risk, and an unpriceable risk is an uninsurable risk. And an uninsurable ship doesn't sail. Then there's the crew. A reactor doesn't need a diesel mechanic. It needs licensed nuclear operators, and it needs them at sea, in rotation, for weeks at a time, on a commercial merchant vessel. The global pool of people qualified to do that is small, expensive, and mostly employed by navies and power utilities. And behind all of it is the one nobody can regulate away: security. A civilian vessel carrying nuclear material, traveling through international waters, past choke points where piracy is a live and documented problem. The physical risk of someone stealing usable material from a molten salt reactor is genuinely very low. The fuel is a hot liquid inside a sealed circulating loop, which is close to the worst possible thing to try to steal. But genuinely very low and politically acceptable are two entirely different standards, and only one of them decides whether a ship gets a berth. So the wall is real. It's just not made of physics. It's made of paperwork, insurers, and voters, which raises the question of why China would build it anyway. Let's zoom out, because if you only look at this as a shipping story, you'll miss the point. China controls a very large share of global shipbuilding capacity. It operates several of the world's busiest container ports. It's the largest exporter on the planet, which means it is also the single largest customer of the global shipping industry, an industry it doesn't set the rules for. Fuel is bought in dollars on global markets, and it travels through choke points that China does not control. The Strait of Malacca alone carries an enormous fraction of China's energy imports through a channel that is, at its narrowest, a couple of kilometers wide. A fleet that doesn't refuel doesn't care about any of that. And here's the part that makes the port problem look different. If most of the world's ports won't accept a nuclear vessel, but a handful of enormous ones will, and if those ports happen to be positioned on the routes that matter most, then the ship doesn't need global acceptance. It needs a corridor, two ends, and a lane between them. Now, I want to be straight with you about what is and isn't proven here, because a lot of coverage of this story blurred the line badly. The land-based thorium molten salt reactor in Gansu is real, and it has operated. That part is not in question. The KN-24AP is a design. It has been unveiled. It has received approval in principle from an international classification society, which is a meaningful, serious step and not a rubber stamp. But approval in principle is not a keel being laid. It means the concept has been reviewed and judged sound enough to proceed. It does not mean the ship exists in a dock today, and scaling a reactor from a desert test unit to a 200-megawatt class marine propulsion plant is a genuinely enormous jump. Molten salt is chemically aggressive. It attacks metal. Oak Ridge had to develop an entirely bespoke nickel alloy just to hold it, and even that showed signs of attack over time in a reactor that ran for a fraction of a ship's lifespan. A vessel needs that alloy to survive decades at sea, inside a hull that flexes and twists in heavy weather, while the fluid inside it is both radioactive and corrosive. That's not a small footnote. That's the hardest unsolved materials problem in the entire concept. So what should you actually watch for? 3 things. The first is steel. Watch for a keel laying, not a press release. Designs get unveiled constantly at shipping exhibitions, and most of them never touch water. The moment a hull is physically under construction with a reactor compartment in it, this becomes a completely different story. The second is the corrosion data. Watch how long the Gansu reactor runs continuously, and watch whether they publish anything on alloy performance. Sustained operation over years, not months, is the evidence that the materials problem is genuinely under control. Without that, the ship is a beautiful idea with a countdown timer inside it. The third, and this is the one that actually decides everything, is the first port agreement. The day any major international port publicly agrees to accept a nuclear commercial vessel, the entire 60-year deadlock breaks. Not because the technology changed, but because the political question finally got answered by someone willing to answer it. And here's the thing that makes